feels as though Scotland has been enveloped in a rain cloud for over a month. So to enjoy a bit of sun here and there, we've had to layer up and accept the inevitable rain shower. But it's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's incredibly peaceful. Walking in the forest is a little less risky as I'm sheltered by the leaves above. And so I've become very familiar with the details of the forest path, and I recently felt very inspired to paint it. In this video, I'll share how I painted this gouache scene with only 4 colors and talk through my process along the way. And don't forget, I have tons of full-length tutorials on my Patreon page, as well as several classes on Skillshare made for beginners and everyone else. So first I'll show a full time lapse of the process, which in itself is very revealing. And then I'll slow it down a bit and share some of my thoughts and lessons learned. Feel free to click on the chapters of this video to jump to different areas. I painted this over several days, and so you'll see the camera changing angles here and there. And I also wanted to point out that I was using these colors, which I'll show on screen right now. You can do a lot with a limited palette, and it's something I really encourage you to try if you're new to painting in general. It teaches you so much about color mixing.
Get out of your skin. All it is matters. Let it in. If I could, I would be right here.
One of the first challenges we face is to figure out how to translate our inspiration to the paper. I don't like to copy reference photos, but rather use what I felt on location and the details I capture in the photos to inspire a painting. So one of the first things I do is to scroll through my photos and recall memories of what it felt like to be there. It's not just about painting what I saw. It's about somehow capturing the energy I felt and the magical lighting that I experienced. Photos can help trigger those memories, so I can keep that at the forefront of my mind as I paint. In terms of composition, I'll usually scratch in some loose lines to give myself somewhere to start. Since this painting will focus on a pathway, that's one of the things I'll worry about now, because after this I'll start dropping in some underlying color. And I'll also draw in some of the major trees, as those will get special attention later. The first layer of gouache is very diluted with water, and I treat it exactly like watercolor. I get the paper wet first, then lay in heavy washes of color, letting things bleed together naturally. I'm squinting my eyes as I do this, mainly focused on the values, and mentally visualizing how the light will move through the forest. It's quick and messy and so much fun. And then I'll let this first wash dry before moving on to details. Since gouache is an opaque medium, it's much easier to paint background elements first and then continue to layer up all the details. So depending on the scene, some background elements that I'll focus on first could be clouds, or distant flowers and bushes, or tree leaves, or pine needles that are going to be slightly behind the trees that I'll paint in the foreground. It varies quite a bit. So what you see now is me painting some slightly more detailed pine needle clusters on top of some very watered down wet into wet pine needle clusters. So I'm layering up the forms of the tree little by little. In order to paint a very lush looking forest, you have to layer quite a lot. And the more you vary the colors and the values and the actual forms of what you're painting, the better. And at first it can feel a little overwhelming to approach a painting, especially a larger size like this, knowing you have to do so much detail. So usually I'll just pick an area and get to work. It ends up being a lot, I mean a lot of repetition, whether it's leaves or branches or flowers, but you can kind of get into sort of a trance or like a meditative state of mind as you do this. Sometimes I'll be painting for an hour and I completely zone out or zone into a podcast I'm listening to, and before I know it, I have a forest. So let me talk you through this little corner of this painting because I show you how I layer up the background and start to go into the foreground details. But first, let's take a look at what was inspiring me to paint this. What I loved about the forest this day was that there was such bright light coming from the distance, pouring through the forest. I wasn't so concerned with the haziness, but more that the light was just catching the tips of the grass and the foliage and almost feeling like this magical, enchanted forest. So as I begin to lay in some of the background elements, my first thought is, how can I capture that sense of light? Well, after careful observation, I noticed that some of the bushes or trees that are separating this midground from the distance, they have a very quick change in value. So the tops of the bushes will get a really, really intense, bright yellowish green or even pure yellow. And then as the bush gets closer to the ground, it's very, very dark. And what this effect does is mimic how the light comes through the forest and just catches the tips of those leaves, making them appear backlit, but then the fullness of the bush itself it's almost like casting a shadow on itself. So it gets really, really dark near the base. But as we know, color and value are relative. So these bushes at the moment don't seem very bright or vivid. Once I start layering in the tree trunk color, and especially later as I begin to beef up some of the values, these colors that I'm adding will really help intensify the greens. If you ever want to intensify your greens, add a complementary color nearby. They will help visually play off of each other. Because I often love to stylize colors in my paintings, I'm not going for a brown tree trunk. I like to play with blues and purples in my trees. That's just my personal aesthetic. Of course, you can do whatever you want. I'll continue to build up the leaves and bushes or whatever is around the tree, sometimes overlapping them. But as I build up the depth, I'm thinking I can always come back later. I don't go too far with the detail for now. I'm still kind of getting the base colors down of everything because with gouache, the beauty is that you can always come back and layer up more and more. Sometimes it's helpful to lay in some of the grass or moss or whatever the trees are growing out of just to help kind of ground that area. I mean, literally ground it, because then you kind of know where everything else is going to come out of. Okay, so now that you've seen how I build up the detail in this little corner of the painting, you have a pretty good idea of what I do elsewhere. This midground to background area will be repeated throughout the painting. As forms and light changes, I will adjust accordingly, but this is my general process. I've already made a mistake in this painting. Can you tell what it is? I painted right through where one of my main trees are going to be. So I clearly got a little carried away. I must have been listening to a really good podcast and I kept going with the leaves. But another great thing about gouache is that you can reactivate the paint and remove some of it. All of it won't come off, but that doesn't really matter. I'll just get the majority off with a wet brush and then I can paint right over it with my darker color. As I continue to lay in some of the grasses, I'm starting to think, which area of the painting do I want to work on next? And you might notice throughout this process that my attention span is short, so I jump around a lot in different areas. But it's fine as long as I'm building from the ground up. So again, gouache is opaque. We need to build in layers. Another thing I want to mention is that the underlayer that I started with was pretty much the only wet into wet that I'm going to do in this painting. Everything else is all dry brush. And I actually just taught a class for Etcher called Mastering Dry Brush Technique with Gouache. So I'll put a link to that in the description as soon as that becomes available for downloading. But for this painting, what I'm mostly doing is using my flat brushes, loading it up with gouache continually because it runs out pretty quick. Whenever you're using really thirsty paper, you have to constantly reload. So every time you see my brush go off the side of the paper, I'm either cleaning my brush off or getting more water or dipping it in the gouache. I like to vary the thickness of the gouache here and there on the forest floor so that some areas let a little bit of that undercolor show through and other areas are more of like pure thick gouache. Honestly, the more variety you have in a forest, the better. So instead of doing solid chunks of color, try to vary the amount of gouache on your brush as well as the color and the types of brush strokes you're using. So it might be quick vertical brush strokes like making little grassy marks, or it might be long horizontal sweeps of color. Just vary it as much as you can. For my focus trees, I go much darker and more punchier with color. So whatever colors I chose for the tree trunks, I will make it even more intense. These trees are going to draw the viewer in, and in this case, this darkness is going to act as a way to make the brightness of the light in the painting seem even more intense. So that saying, you can't have light without the darkness, it's completely true. It's all relative in our painting. By using much more saturated colors and more intense values in the foreground, or at least where my focus is, that's going to make the other areas of the painting kind of fade off and just act as sort of supporting characters to my focus, which is exactly what we want. So when in doubt, if you want an area of your painting to be kind of more of a secondary area, not the focus, use less intense colors and values. With gouache, if you add a bit of white or black to your color, it automatically reduces the saturation. So just in those background areas or areas that you do not want to be the focus, try adding a bit of black or white and see how much of a difference that makes. Of course, we can dive so deep down into the rabbit hole of color theory, like how to use color to draw the focus to an area, but that's just like a really quick solution. Now that I've laid in a bit more color and detail in the foreground, I'm getting a better sense of the overall values I want to use in the painting, and I'll start jumping back to the background or other side areas. Now that I've laid in some of the colors and values in the foreground, I'm starting to get a better sense of the overall value structure of my painting. That could have been something I worked out by doing thumbnails beforehand, but I didn't. When I say value structure, I mean how light and dark things are overall. So what is the spectrum of light and dark areas of my painting? Well, as you can see in the foreground focus tree that I just painted, it's very, very dark. And in the distant sky and first wash of color I did, it's very light. So that's the overall spectrum. Everything else I do has to sort of fit within that, and I can use value in different areas of the painting to make it either a focus area or not. But there is a lot to fill in, like all the little stuff that needs to happen before I can really play with color and texture and overall values. So this mid-ground area is a lot of leaves, a lot of undergrowth, a lot of ferns, and just all sorts of stuff that I need to lay in. Once I get that more established, I can start playing with the fun stuff. Here I'm starting to add some of my brighter yellow and yellowish green tones, and overall this area of the mid to background is going to be the brighter part, so I'm really trying to make it feel like the sun is coming through this area the strongest. So establishing where your light is coming from is really helpful because then all of your shadows that are cast down by trees or whatever objects you have are going to be facing the same direction or going in the correct direction. They kind of all need to work together. If you have shadows going every which way, it just won't make sense, and it might not be super noticeable to the viewer at first, but overall it plays an important role in the painting. So if I know where my light source is, I can start adding the brighter highlights that are falling across the mosses and the grasses and everything that's growing on the forest floor. And at this point, I will also start darkening some of the shadows on the forest floor. And I have to admit, I'm a bit of a wimp when it comes to adding my deeper values. Usually it takes me a while to build up enough courage to go really dark. But the cool thing about gouache is that once you get it on the paper, even if it's a little bit too dark or too bright, it's super easy to adjust because you can reactivate it forever. So you can always come back in with a bit of color or white or black or whatever and change it up a little bit. Now, since the pathway is kind of a big focus of this painting, I can't neglect that for much longer. So I'll start to touch in a variety of colors. In the shadows, I tend to lean more towards blue and purple, but especially adding a bit of white to lighten it up a bit. The salmon color that I put down first is one of my favorite undertones for a pathway in a forest because I can let a bit of that pop through here and there. It definitely stands out from all the green that's around it, and I can continue to layer up details and other colors on top of it. To add some interest to these foreground trees, I want to make them a bit different. I don't want them to just be perfectly straight. So I'll add some branches and also some twisty roots that will maybe fall across the pathway. Or, I don't know, just play with the forms and make it a little more interesting. And I also don't want my forest floor to just be flat and boring. I want to add mounds of moss and rocks and fallen branches and all sorts of variety. Now that I'm really starting to see the overall forms and values and colors in my painting, this is when I can go into the nitty-gritty details. This is also the point in the painting where I can get kind of burned out or feel like it's just moving so slow because I'm at the detail stage. The bark of the tree is technically reflecting a bit of the atmosphere, and depending on how smooth or rough it is, it will vary, but I like to lean those reflections a little bit more towards blue on the side of the tree that is facing away from the light source. I will add a bit of brownish warm highlights on the side that's facing the light, but kind of give it like a dappled light effect. So not big solid streaks of light, just little touches here and there with a dry brush technique. If there's a tree that's more directly in front of my light source, I will add a bit of rim lighting, meaning I'll do a touch of highlight, some of that warmer color on the edges of the tree. Usually on both sides, but it also kind of depends on the angle of the sun. The grasses and everything that are growing in the shadow areas will also lean more towards blue because, again, those are reflecting the atmosphere. If a leaf or some grass are backlit, it'll lean more towards yellow. I'm not trying to go overboard with detail, but I am trying to develop a lot of variety in what I'm adding to the forest floor. Something I have been working on in my forest paintings are creating more of a variety and an interest and a lushness, something that doesn't look fake, something that feels more real, yet still has my style in it. I can play with colors and I can play with lighting effects, but I really do want to capture the essence of the forest and, like bring it all back to my original source of inspiration. This is another reason that I like to paint larger when I'm working on a more detailed piece, because even with a larger piece like this and using tiny brushes, I can still only get so much detail. But the larger you go, the longer it takes, and burnout is a possibility. So stepping away frequently from the painting, letting it span across days at a time, even if it's between other projects, is the only way I can actually complete something like this. Taking lots of breaks gives me a little bit more of a renewed energy each time I come back to it. There were so many times where I would be painting and just kind of going cross-eyed with all the details, and I'd be like, okay, that's it. That's all I can possibly do. And then I would come back to it the next day and be like, oh, you know what? I could actually do a little bit more here or there. And of course, you could continue that forever. So the way I know that my paintings are done are when I do step away and then come back to it with fresh eyes, and I feel that original source of inspiration in the painting. When I get a sense of the light, when I feel like I want to step into the painting and walk through the forest, that's when I know it's ready. One of my final steps for making the pathway feel a bit more walked on was to take my fan brush with a variety of colors and just kind of roughen it up a bit. I didn't want it to feel so smooth. So by adding a variety of colors and textures here and there, it just all came together into a much more realistic path. So I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this process. If you have any questions about the process, I will do my best to answer them in the comments below. But otherwise, as I said, you can find tons of tutorials of mine over on my Patreon and Skillshare. And as soon as the Etcher demo is available, I will share that in the description below. But otherwise, I hope you are all staying well and enjoying the spring, and I will see you again soon. Take care, everybody.